everybody, if you'd like to take your seats, we'll be starting momentarily. If everybody could please take their seats. Can everybody hear us okay up here? Okay, thanks very much, everybody, and good morning. Thanks a lot for joining us here today. My name is Will Dempster, and I'm a Vice President at McBee Strategic Consulting, and we're very pleased to bring everyone here today for a discussion on this very important topic. Although we posed the title of this event as a question, I would argue that the events of the last 2 years have indeed reaffirmed that NATO is both important and relevant in the 21st century. In the past 2 years, we've witnessed the Russian annexation of Crimea, how it threatened our Baltic it continues to threaten our Baltic allies, violated the airspace of our Turkish ally, and used energy as a weapon of war against our allies in Europe, as launched sophisticated cyber attacks against the West. At the same time, the residual consequences of the Syrian civil war, from the refugee crisis to the rise of the Islamic State, offer new challenges to confront and opportunities for greater NATO-wide collaboration. I can't think of a better panel of experts to sort out the issues that we have in front of us today than the one we've assembled. And I'm very pleased to welcome Governor Bill Richardson, who, in addition to being the former governor of New Mexico, served as our country's ambassador to the United Nations, as our Secretary of Energy, and as a congressman for many terms. His Excellency Rolandus Kriščiūnas of Lithuania, His Excellency Hennis Schuer of the Netherlands, and Dr. Curtis Levinson, the U.S. Cyber Defense Advisor to NATO. I'm very eager to hear what each of our panelists has to say today. But first, I would like to introduce a man whose career in public service really is so impressive that I don't even think I can really do him justice in an introduction. For more than 30 years, Bill Richardson's led a distinguished career in public service, first as a U.S. Congressman from 1982 to 1996, as the United States' ambassador to the United Nations from 1997 to 1998, and as Secretary of Energy under President Clinton from 1998 to 2000, and of course as Governor of New Mexico. During his time in public service, Governor Richardson was particularly renowned for his powerhouse diplomacy, which not only facilitated the release of many American hostages abroad, but also resulted in 4 nominations for the Nobel Peace Prize. After a run for president in 2008 and the completion of his term as governor, Governor Richardson remained dedicated to the causes he championed in office as a private citizen. In particular, I would like to note the work the governor has done under the aegis of his Foundation for Global Engagement. I could certainly go on for much longer, but I would like to thank Governor Richardson for joining us. I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Will. You can go on much longer if you like. That was a very, very generous introduction. In fact, one of you said to me, well, Bill, what do you know about NATO? As you will find out, not much. No, I do. Russia was something that I dealt with extensively when I was at Energy and at the UN, the Security Council, energy issues. So I want to also thank McBee, a strategic group, for putting this event together. In the old days, one of the things that many of you don't have that I have is that I'm old and you're not. I've been around, and I see how things get done in Washington now. And McBee and Wiley Fain, this is the way you get things done, by discussing issues, by having these kind of events. Social media, advocacy, and I'm just delighted to be part of this effort, and I'm very happy to be with some very distinguished ambassadors, with the country's foremost cyber expert on my right. I hope he doesn't hack my iPhone. But let me just say that it's great to be with Ambassador Kriščiūnas, Ambassador Schuer, Dr. Levinson. I don't think there's a more important time than today to talk about NATO. in the 21st century. You know, I doubt very much that any policymakers who witnessed the collapse of the Soviet Union 25 years ago would have predicted the reemergence of a Russian military threat to the security and sovereignty of our European allies today. And yet, Russian actions once again pose the greatest geopolitical threat to the United States and its allies. This threat is multidimensional, it's asymmetrical, it manifests itself in the form of troop movements, cyber attacks. Defending our allies from Russian activity certainly requires a resolve of a united and determined NATO alliance. And while we must focus most of our discussion about NATO's role in confronting Russia, we must also consider the alliance's role in addressing a broader array of issues. In particular, we must consider how to confront the humanitarian tragedy of the Syrian refugee crisis and the emergence of a new transnational terrorist threat in ISIS. These are critical issues. I look forward to discussing them today. When I was in government at the time, we talked about out-of-area issues. Should NATO get involved in out-of-area issues? Obviously it should, but at the time, there's a very strong reluctance at that time for this not to happen. But now, this has to happen. 2 years following Russia's annexation of Crimea and the beginning of its guerrilla war in eastern Ukraine, I've frankly been disturbed by those who argue that expanding NATO and Russia's historic sphere of influence was a historic mistake. Sandy Berger just passed away, President Clinton's national security advisor. This was his, I believe, most important accomplishment, the expansion of NATO. He worked on that tirelessly for years and years. And Sandy was a great expert in this area. And when I think back to the early years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, I remember how many of my colleagues in Congress thought that NATO was no longer necessary. In fact, one of my colleagues here isn't widely famous. His name is Congressman Jim Slattery. He and I came in 1982 to the Congress together. By the way, I expected Slattery to be here, at least to say hello to me. Tell him that he's become a very wealthy lawyer, and I will remember him in my will. I will not remember him. No, he was a great congressman who was very instrumental in ending the war in Central America. I'll get into that if anybody wants to hear. But at the time, NATO, it was argued, should essentially become the victim of its own success and simply vanish as a relic of the Cold War. And like President Clinton, who I had the honor to serve as ambassador to the UN and Secretary of Energy, I saw NATO's potential as a tool that we could build a new economic, political, and defense architecture for Europe. To our new allies in Eastern Europe, NATO membership not only provided a permanent safeguard of independence, but also a multitude of opportunities for cultural, political, and economic collaboration with the West. And here's where I think President Obama and his team have done a very good job of working with NATO, working with Europe, the European Union, restoring our strength as a European ally after many years of neglect. And the success of this strategy has been self-evident. In the years following NATO expansion, our new Eastern European allies have contributed to the stability of the Balkan Peninsula after a decade of war and helped the United States liberate Afghanistan from the Taliban. These are achievements we should be proud of. Now we can't deny that NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe and American influence with it has deeply unsettled Russia. But we should not deny the very tangible and positive role NATO expansion played in European integration. I want to share a brief story that I believe clarifies the dangerous moment that NATO faces today. Last month, I read a disturbing report published by the RAND Corporation about the outcome of a series of war games modeling a potential Russian invasion of one or more of our Baltic allies. The report noted that based on our current state of readiness and force posture in Europe, Russia would defeat NATO forces and would advance in either Vilnius or Tallinn to magnificent, magnificent cities in only 3 days. This report is disturbing. It's disturbing criticism of our state of readiness in Europe and underscores how we must provide our Baltic and Eastern European allies the forces necessary to defend themselves. And fulfilling this obligation requires a reassessment of our force posture in Europe. At a minimum, we must increase the number of armored divisions we've stationed in Europe. We must continue to provide our allies with the most effective tools so that they can continue to contribute to their own defense. NATO must also recognize that the Russian assault on Ukraine is but a taste of Russia's overall aspirations in Europe. And in my view, the United States and its allies should provide the direct sale of advanced military hardware that would allow Ukraine, a great nation, to defend itself. But look, I'm a diplomat at heart. I understand that while it's important to demonstrate the strength of our resolve to Russia, we must also look to new forms of diplomacy as a way to strengthen our allies. In particular, it's critically important that we use our renewed strength as an energy superpower to safeguard our allies from Russian market manipulation. In particular, we must invest a great deal more in opening new export terminals for liquefied natural gas. Doing so would neuter Russia's use of natural gas as a political and coercive weapon against our European and Middle Eastern allies. I also think that having lifted the ban of oil export and natural gas makes a lot of sense. And if you look at the good bargain that the Congress made at the end of the last session was, in exchange for tax incentives for solar and wind, the ban on oil export was lifted. This was a win-win for both sides for our energy policy. I would also argue that we must use diplomacy to marshal our efforts to convince our European allies to invest more in their own national defense. This is particularly important at a time when the American people are calling on their leaders to spend more time addressing domestic issues and less on foreign adventures. We're not going to get into the U.S. election, or we'll never end this morning session, which is on strategic issues, but I think you know what I mean. The Russian threat is certainly important, but we also have to look at the role of NATO in the Middle East. We must also remain vigilant to threats lurking at Europe's periphery, particularly the consequences of the humanitarian disaster in Syria. Although I've been heartened by the early success of the partial ceasefire negotiated by Secretary Kerry, the failure of the coalition to manage the situation effectively on the ground in Syria continues to have negative consequences for our allies. It's a mistake, I believe, to dismiss a role for NATO in addressing the consequences of our previous problems in Syria. To date, we've allowed unclear thinking to limit how we can respond to what's happening there. So I see a role for NATO in the Syrian issue. Although I've heard many proposals for the implementation of a no-fly zone in Syria, few of these proposals have the strategic coherence to succeed. Although, let me just state, I favor a no-fly zone in Syria. I think it is time doing it properly. Establishing an effective no-fly zone as part of a strategy to stabilize the situation in Syria will be effective only if executed under the NATO umbrella. And establishing this zone would first require extensive diplomacy with Turkey to discontinue its assault on Syrian Kurds. Establishing a no-fly zone would not solve the Syrian civil war, but it would help provide a measure of humanitarian relief from Bashar al-Assad's war crimes and facilitate a new joint initiative against the Islamic State. If successful, such an initiative could provide a meaningful blueprint for how NATO can improve internal security by operating outside of its traditional theater of operations. Such an out-of-area initiative would in turn provide a meaningful and hopefully successful blueprint for NATO involvement outside its traditional theater of operations. In conclusion, as President Clinton said in the convention, I think in 1998, and he went on for 2 hours, I'm not going to do that. Over the past decade, many American policymakers made the same mistakes their counterparts did 25 years ago by questioning the relevance of NATO. whether it's through confronting the resurgent Russia, tackling the residual consequences of the Syrian civil war. NATO is not only relevant to our national security, it is essential to preserve it. And through our discussion today, I'm eager to hear the perspectives of our allies like Lithuania and the Netherlands, the cyber threat, and how the NATO alliance can continue to form the foundation of regional security in Europe. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Governor. It was a really interesting take on the situation. And I'm eager, once we get to the discussion, to dive into some more of those issues. Next, it's my great privilege to introduce His Excellency Ambassador Rolandas Kriščiūnas of Lithuania. Ambassador Kriščiūnas has led a distinguished career of public service that has taken him to the highest positions in the halls of the Lithuanian government and its Ministry of Foreign Affairs. After beginning his diplomatic career working at the Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Economic Division in 1993, Ambassador Kriščiūnas first came to the United States as a first secretary at the embassy here in 2001. After returning home, Ambassador Kriščiūnas rose to become first the Vice Minister of Finance and then the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania. We are very pleased that he returned to the United States in his current role as Ambassador in 2015. Thank you, Ambassador, for joining us, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a wonderful event. And the topic is, I couldn't come up with a more relevant one. So the topic itself is already very relevant. And of course, let me start by noting that this week, actually, on Friday, Lithuania will be celebrating 26 years anniversary of its independence. And that's a very symbolic date for us. Of course, in our eyes, in 1990, March 11th, when Lithuania announced independence, and Lithuania was the first country to announce independence, and so its states. Of course, in our eyes, it did injustices which were done to us after World War II, which left us captive to Soviets. And we are a small country, loving freedom, loving peace, and of course we are not a threat to anyone. And I could say for all the other Baltic states, which are success stories actually of the 20th century. If you would look at any kind of indexes, be it economic freedom, innovation, and so you'll find the Baltic states at the very top. So that the countries which are striving to be open, trading with everyone, looking at our relationship in the neighborhood, with the wide open eyes, looking for business opportunities, and that's how we would like to treat the region. And of course, at the same time, I think we are very good indicators is there is everything right in our region. If the Baltic states feel at ease, and that's a world I think we all would like to live, where everyone looks at the business opportunities, everyone looks for the peace, nobody is a threat to anyone. And but unfortunately, I cannot tell that in the region we are feeling at ease. So we are very concerned with the developments. It's not something which happened yesterday. We saw in 2008 when a part of Georgia was taken. And of course, what we can see later, it's Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, where we have a crisis at the moment, which we still, I think, quite a distance for any kind of solution there. And of course, all this raises the questions of stability and of security system. We were building for a number of years since World War II. That was a very big peaceful period in Europe, unprecedented maybe. But this system is being challenged, and aggressive Russia would like to play by the rules, of 19th century and mid-20th century, and so of course that was quite a nasty world we would not, at least in Lithuania, would like to get back to. And of course it makes us to be much more conscious about our defense expenditure, specifically by the government. We have political parties agreeing on increasing it to 2% of GDP by 2020. The current dynamics will show that we could do it in 2018, which will be quite an achievement because in 2018 Lithuania will be celebrating 100 years anniversary of announcement of independence back in 1918. That was the first independence we got in the 20th century. And so we're increasing our expenditures. We see that, of course, earlier, and it's quite indicative, we haven't seen that Russia should be a threat. After the collapse of Soviet Union, Lithuania have taken it that it will be happily ever after. And of course, the rhetorics at that time by the President Yeltsin were the ones which were telling that Russia itself was a victim of Soviet regime, and that kind of put all the republics at the same level. So all were victims of Soviet regime. And of course, unfortunately, Putin, when he came to power, he called the collapse of Soviet Union, which had given to us freedom, was the largest tragedy of the 20th century. In our eyes, the largest tragedy was World War II. And of course, and that rhetoric changed quite dramatic perception of what's happening. Of course, as said, it makes us to invest in peace. We are, of course, increasing our defense expenditures. At the same time, we reintroduce conscription. We have a professional army, now we have conscription, so every year we're inviting people to join army and to increase our capacity to fight off any kind of threat we could be facing. At the same time, of course, it's not just about military and defense. Lithuania was investing in its energy independence together with our Baltic nations. Of course, it's very important to have much big resilience towards any kind of pressures, and energy was one of those we were facing all the time, because we were paying the largest prices in Europe for gas. We were paying political prices for gas because we had no alternative. So Moscow was calling the prices we will be facing every year. So which was, of course, destroying the gas market as such, because it got so expensive, the people started to invest in some other means of heating, not using gas, because it was so expensive. And of course, it made us thinking and how we could get some alternative. And we built an LNG terminal, which we opened last year. And this year will be the first year when there will be much more gas coming from outside Russia to Lithuania than from Russia. That's the first year ever. It took us some distance to work, but currently we have the freedom to choose the best price ever. And I do expect that one day US gas actually will be reaching the shores of the Baltic. So if it comes to Baltics, it could come anywhere in Europe. And it will be very symbolic, and I hope that there will be the commercial terms that will be allowing it to be done. Also, we have built last year, by the end of last year, we built 2 electricity transmission lines connecting the Baltic electricity market to Scandinavia. We built a Nordbal, that's that which connects us to Sweden by the bottom of the Baltic Sea. And we built another electricity transmission line to Poland, which connects us to Western European network. And that's also gives us the opportunity to become an integral part of the markets in electricity. So yes, of course, we're investing on our own quite heavily, but we need our allies in NATO, and coming to the subject, to help us to resist, to be able to resist any kind of threat. And of course, we have not the smallest doubt that the NATO will be up for the task. We believe that if anyone would like to test its resilience and ability to defend its members, will make a huge mistake. But of course, the consequences could be so dire. We should do everything possible to help someone not to make this mistake. And how we see it, how to make it. Of course, we see that we would like to see a bigger NATO presence in the Baltic states, so that there will be no doubt that just crossing the border in NATO will be right there. If anyone who is crossing the border of any of the Baltic nations will meet NATO right there at the moment it crosses the border. Of course, we would like to see that assurance, which we got in Wales NATO summit, will become deterrence, of course, in Warsaw. Also, we see the need that our implementation of so-called rapid action plan getting into the stage where we'll have a long-term adaptation measures being put in place. And I don't think that I often hear the rhetorics that all this could provoke Russia. I think what provokes Russia is softness and vulnerability. And if it will be very clear that there is NATO right on the other side of the border. And NATO is not a threat to anyone. I mean, whoever told that it's a threat to whatever country, it's nonsense, because it would mean that this the person who tells it probably doesn't know about NATO, about decision making and mechanisms and so on. So it's just impossible to see NATO as a threat. You know, it's really not an argument in my eyes. So it's not a strategy just for defensive purposes, of course, but it should be clear that anyone fancies to cross the border of NATO countries, you know, will face NATO right away. And I think that's not kind of asking for war, it's asking for peace. So we are not to fight in the Baltics. We are there, and I hope we will see a NATO forces there in much more meaningful numbers to prevent any kind of war, to make even the slightest idea of challenging NATO and in probability and so on. Of course, we are very happy that the United States is understanding it, and the European Reassurance Initiative, which is being proposed as to increase it quite substantially to 3.4 billion. I hope that that will be the case. It's currently discussed in Congress. I think it sends quite very right signals to anyone who would be willing to oppose NATO, and so we are on the good track, and I hope that we will continue on this good track. So that's my initial remarks, and we are very much answering to the question, if as relevant as it could be, you know, these days. So I have not the slightest doubt, and being a little bit, you know, provocative, I say I would hope there will come a day, you know, when NATO will be less relevant. I would like to see the coming than it is today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Christianos. Really appreciate your input into the discussion. Now it's my pleasure to introduce His Excellency Ambassador Hennis Schuur of the Netherlands. Ambassador Schuur has served his country with great distinction in the Dutch diplomatic corps for 36 years. And he began his career as a diplomat at the Dutch embassy in Vietnam. Over the years, he's also served as his country's ambassador to Belgium and as the director of the private office of the Secretary General of NATO. This is actually his third tour of duty in the United States, where he first served, as we were discussing earlier, as consul in the Dutch Consulate General in Los Angeles, and also as the Deputy Chief of Mission here in Washington from 1997 to 2002. He began his tour of duty as Dutch Ambassador to the United States in September, which is fortuitously coincided with his country's assumption of the Netherlands holding the rotating presidency of the European community. Ambassador Schuur, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, and it's great to be here. I might be permitted to speak on with two hats on, basically the Ambassador of the Netherlands, but also, as you mentioned, the President of the European Union, so I will sort of approach this question a little bit from the European side and from the EU side. As you have heard, I've served 3 years as Director of the Private Office, Chief of Staff of the Secretary General of NATO, and you will not hear out of my mouth that NATO is no longer relevant. I have a soft spot for NATO, and I think it is more relevant than ever at the moment. However, there are a number of things that we have to bear in mind. Let me start with, I was present when your former Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, held a farewell speech at the Solvay Library in Brussels, and he reminded his audience, all Europeans, at that time, saying, I am the last one of a certain class, a certain breed in the United States who will now leave office. Everybody who comes after me will not have the almost automatic Pavlov reaction if you mention the word Europe. The generations who will come after me have a different idea, a different feeling about Europe than I have. I have grown up, he said, with Europe. My father fought in the war. I have a certain feeling with Europe. You will get now a generation of Americans who do not share that same sentiment, so you have to work harder on the relationship, you being the Europeans, on the relationship with the US. That has made a deep impression on me and made me realize that indeed what was a given for us in Europe, the United States will always be there and will always come to our defense if necessary, might not be the case. It is remarkable that the United States still has such a large military presence in Europe so many years after the end of the Second World War. And not only in Europe, you have a presence in Asia, you have a presence in South America, you have a presence almost everywhere. It's remarkable that you maintain the presence. I salute you for it. I think it's essential for world peace, but I think it would be foolish of anyone in the world to go by the assumption that the United States will be there forever. I'm just putting that out there. Secondly, I want to look at the European Union and NATO in the light of the threats we are facing. I'm of the opinion that the threat of an all-out war, like we've seen in the First and the Second World War, probably is no longer likely. What we are facing now is a totally different type of war. It's a war of destabilizing your next door neighbor. And we've seen that, especially to the east of us, the role that the Soviet Union used to play, now Russia is playing. We have a hybrid warfare. It's more effective in a way for Russia to bomb Aleppo and to send a stream of refugees going to Europe than to create a military threat to Europe. It's more destabilizing for Europe. Like we did the last year, we received 1.5 million refugees. We might receive the same number this year. We are very much working towards trying to control that flow, but it has an immensely destabilizing effect. As the governor mentioned, energy has become a weapon. Cyber has become a weapon. I live in a country which is 60% below sea level. We are protected by dunes, by dikes, and by levee. And anybody can see that a cyber attack aimed at our defenses against water might be much more effective than anything else. So therefore, we are fighting a different kind of war. For that different kind of war, you need a different kind of alliance. I am pleading here, and so does my government, for a much closer cooperation between the European Union and NATO. I've served in both. I've been ambassador to the EU. I've been chief of staff of NATO. The offices of those two organizations are five miles apart. They might be on different continents. East is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet is totally true for the EU and NATO. We do not cooperate together. This disastrous results, especially financially. All our countries in Europe are trying to get up to the 2% mark for their defense expenditure. The vast majority of countries in Europe do not make that 2%. To compound that problem by having twin structures in the EU and NATO is ridiculous. Let me give you an example. Both organizations, the EU and NATO, were active off the coast of Somalia. You have two fleets there, sailing there, doing exactly the same stuff, of two organizations who share 21 nations in common. That's stupidity. Worse, both fleets were organized from the same naval base in the UK. I think the headquarters, the chain of command, ended in that naval base, I think 100 yards apart from each other. Left the NATO operation, right the EU operation. Everybody knows that the NATO operation or the United States has better satellite imagery than whoever in the world, which means that the guy from the EU had to run over to the guys from NATO to look at their satellite images to know where the sailing boat was, and then they would run back and say, ship X has to go there and there because there are the pirates, etc., etc. This is not the way to go about it. So I'm pleading for a much closer alliance between NATO and the EU. I think, and it's no secret, that we are at the moment a long way ahead on the negotiations in Cyprus. Cyprus has been a stumbling block between the EU and NATO and has divided two NATO members, Greece and Turkey, on the issue. That's one of the reasons why there was never a closer connection between the EU and NATO. I think that if Cyprus has been resolved, we should make haste by closer aligning the EU and NATO. Other point, important point for that, we both have a rapid reaction force, both in NATO and the EU. I don't know if you know how much it costs to have part of your armed forces on a high state of alert. That costs millions. It's ridiculous to have part of your troops on high alert 1 year for NATO and the other year for the EU. Those are costs you do not have to make, so therefore I think a closer alignment is necessary. The opportunity presents itself before the summer. We have in NATO the Warsaw Summit. The Warsaw Summit will be directly a follow-up from the summit in Wales. We will undoubtedly go for a more ambitious plan for NATO in view of the threats that we are facing, both to the east and to the south. A couple of weeks earlier, High Representative Mogherini will present her strategic concept for the defenses of the European Union. I think it would be a very good idea if those two people, Stoltenberg on the one hand and Mogherini on the other hand, put their drafts together and look at their drafts together and see where the overlaps are and where they can work together. Because in the end, security is a comprehensive security. It's not only a military security, it's an economic security, it's a security that goes well beyond only armed forces. The EU is much better placed than NATO to do the extra bit, while NATO, of course, is our military alliance. There is no comparison between NATO and the EU as far as military might is concerned. Plus, NATO has the incredible advantage that the United States is involved in NATO. The United States is not involved in the EU. I have said every day, every week, 2 days a week, in meetings with the American ambassador. There is no place in the world where you have the advantage of discussing world problems 2 days a week with the American ambassador. The only place is NATO. We should take advantage of that, tying in the United States with our common security and make that a collective security which goes beyond armed forces only. And in order to do that, you need the EU by your side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Very interesting perspective on the intersection of NATO and the European Union. Finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Curtis Levinson, who currently serves as the U.S. Cyber Defense Advisor to NATO. Dr. Levinson has over 25 years of experience advising governments, companies on matters of cybersecurity, information governance, cloud computing, regulatory compliance, and continuity of operations. Dr. Levinson has served with distinction 2 sitting presidents of the United States, 2 chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Mayor's Conference on Homeland Security, and the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Most recently, as I said earlier, he's been selected by the United States to serve as our Cyber Defense Advisor to NATO. Dr. Levinson, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. My thanks to McBee and to Secretary Richardson for allowing me to be here. What I do is craft practical, actionable cybersecurity strategies for organizations, large and small, for nations, large and small, that provide a practical means to cyber defense. And as His Excellency from the Netherlands mentioned, I am part of a NATO rapid reaction force, and I am on endless call out. So far the phone has not rung in the middle of the night, but it may very well. We are in a completely new era in regards to cyberspace. We're experiencing a significant paradigm shift. Up until now, our cybersecurity paradigm has been one of network perimeter defense. We get firewalls, we plug them in, we feel much better. Except now, our adversaries have breached those firewalls. When I look at networks, I assume that every network I view is 100% infected with a variety of botnets and malware, spear phishing. There is always someone in the organization, no matter how much training, someone will click on the link. Please don't click on the link. One of the issues currently facing NATO is the issue of multilateral threat information sharing. That in NATO we have nations at very high levels of technology, and we have nations at very low levels of technology. One of the great equalizers is the ability to share threat information in a way that protects the confidentiality of the sources and enables all of the 28 to have the same information and to be able to respond. Therefore, if there is a specific attack across the banking sector in one nation, the other NATO allies will have the same information. And we're currently working on how to implement this most important project. Every cyber attack against a nation is a violation of national sovereignty. I was speaking with His Excellency, the ambassador from Mexico last night, and I said every time the Mexican government is attacked by the drug cartels, that is a violation of national sovereignty. When Ukraine very recently had their power grid switched off, that was a violation of national sovereignty. When the Russians turned off the power grid in Estonia, which is one of the reasons why the NATO Center for Cybersecurity Excellence is located in Tallinn, those are all violations of national sovereignty. And NATO as an organization is all about preserving national sovereignty. So cyber attacks are a clear violation, and they may have the potential of a military incursion. The 800-pound gorilla that sits with all of us is our power grid. The US and Canada share a power grid. We're interdependent. Europe shares power grids. Power grid attacks can be potentially devastating. Can you imagine what would happen in the DC area with no electricity for 3 weeks? No elevators, no HVAC, no ATM machines, no ability to pump petrol out of tanks, no ability to buy food. All of the war game scenarios that I've been through indicate that after about 3 weeks, the rule of law is going to start to deteriorate, and increased episodes of vigilantism will start occurring, and that's 3 weeks with no power. Beyond that, is, for most of us, unthinkable. And we're facing new kinds of cyber attacks. Recently, a hospital in California was taken hostage. Someone clicked on a link, and their entire hospital information system was encrypted. In part, this is large fault of their inability or poor performance in doing backup and recovery strategy and their business continuity plans, that they were not able to recover. But the hospital wound up paying the ransom in Bitcoin, which is an anonymous, untraceable internet currency. 1 Bitcoin is worth approximately the price of 1 ounce of gold on the spot market. The hospital paid. Now, if they pay once, is this not a steady stream of revenue for the adversaries? Don't the attackers go, hey, they're just going to buy their way out of this. Why ask for 17 million? We asked for 17,000, it got paid. How about we try it again in 6 months? Someone will always click on the link. Some friends of mine with a law firm in suburban Maryland were halfway through one of these crypto locker attacks, and luckily their systems administrator was monitoring. He literally pulled the plug out of the wall on their servers before the encryption got too far. But these, instead of denial of service attacks, preventing access to the internet, corrupting systems, corrupting data, stealing data, now we have kidnapping, hostage taking. And we're always taught never to negotiate with terrorists and never to pay ransom to kidnappers. Because once you pay the ransom, you can either get your funds back or not, and become a victim yet again, or at worst, an annuity to the attackers. Terrorists, such as ISIS, which is the big bad guy in the news, terrorists are communicating via very unusual channels. They're communicating through video games. In video games like Call of Duty, World of Warcraft, others, the characters in the video games are able to interact with each other. By typing on a keyboard, you're actually communicating with another individual playing the character you're interacting. Well, terrorist groups are using this. They're joining these video games like mad. And there's no record of communications inside World of Warcraft. So they're not playing video games, they're meeting up with people all over the world. These are global games. The language of communication within many of these video games is English, but not always. I've seen Mandarin Chinese, I've seen Russian. So all types of new communications channels. We wonder how the terrorists manage to stay ahead of us, because they think quicker than we do. They are not bound to old paradigms. We need to turn the corner into a new paradigm of network core defense, of looking at alternative communication channels. Probably the worst answer in the world when I ask someone, why do you do that? They say, because we always did that. And I'm sorry, in technology, that's not a valid answer. So thank you very much. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Levinson. Very disturbing interesting take on the state of our cyber defenses. I let you know I'd never click on any links. Before we open up to the audience for some questions, I just wanted to get the conversation started. And I'm sorry, Governor, you're not going to be able to avoid this question from me. The big elephant in the room is our presidential election, foreign affairs. It's been an interesting, as an observer of politics, to see how the role foreign policy is played in the election, and particularly with one very prominent individual. So my question is, how do you propose combating this renewed isolationist impulse in American foreign policy, and why, if you agree that it's a problem, what can we do to confront it?
Well, there is a retrenchment, there is an isolationism out in the electorate. It's mainly born out of what I sense as economic frustration and anger, a populism that blames a lot of America's problems on immigrants, on Muslims, on immigration. It's out there. There's no question about it. It's not just on the Republican side. It's mainly on the Republican side, but it's with the electorate. Here's my thinking. Obviously, supporting Secretary Clinton, I think that this election is going to be a watershed election in that you're going to see national security as the dominant issue in the campaign. After the conventions, you're going to see America's role in the world, NATO, ISIS, terrorism, Syria, cyber issues. And I found Dr. Levinson's. This is like a new conflict that is out there that I know nothing about. If you thought I didn't know anything about NATO, just ask me about cyber. But so here's my view, Will. I think what will prevail will be America's continued engagement in the world, probably a view that America's role should be more muscular than it has been. I think that will emerge in who is selected as president. I think that right now there are two schools of thought about Secretary Clinton versus Donald Trump, who I suspect will be the nominee. Although, the delegate count between Trump and Cruz is fairly close. It's about 100 delegates. And that can be narrowed in one winner-take-all primary. But I would say the odds are that Trump is the nominee. Now, there are two schools of thought about Trump as the nominee versus Secretary Clinton. There's one school of thought, which I suspect most Democrats prefer, that what is emerging is a route like when Lyndon Johnson defeated Barry Goldwater, which before all of you were born, but well, not everyone. A route of 40 plus states. That's one school of thought. I don't subscribe to that. There's another school of thought that says this is going to be a race that'll be fairly close, although I think Secretary Clinton will win. The Democrat will win. Because there's populism out there that is expressing itself very strongly through Donald Trump. And I think what's going to be key is the Democrats getting their base up, minority voters, Hispanics, African Americans, union progressives. This is the Democratic coalition. What is going to be, I believe, contested by Trump and Clinton, which will be decisive, is the young voter, those under 30 that that seem to be very independent. They're not following the parents. And I'm including minorities, especially Hispanic youth, that are not bound by the old paradigms of party loyalty. The role of independents that are often decisive in presidential election. The role of women, especially younger women, that are not necessarily attuned to electing the first woman president. They're obviously very independent on this issue. And then lastly, there's reading about the death of a great First Lady, Nancy Reagan. You think of Reagan Democrats, white males. They have been drifting away from the Democratic Party, especially in the South and the Midwest. I think what happens with those voters, they will go generally Republican. White males will. The question is the percentage. And then, which might offset that, would be the minority vote, the African American, especially the Latino vote, the Hispanic vote. No Republican has ever won the Hispanic vote without getting 40% of it. The two Bushes did, Reagan did. It's 40%, the Democrat won 60-40. Mitt Romney got 29%, and he was soundly defeated. I don't think Donald Trump is doing very well with Hispanic votes, so he's going to have to make it up. I know I'm getting I'm getting into the weeds here, but having been in the race myself, although not very long, I lasted through 3 primaries. I see Vice President Biden, and we kid each other. I say, well, Joe, I beat you in Iowa and New Hampshire. You know what he says? He said, yeah, but I'm vice president. So anyway, that's my analysis. I think that internationalism, engagement, will win over isolationism in the end. But I hope I'm not wrong.
Thanks. Ambassador Christianis, as a country that is really on the front lines of this emerging we don't need to call it a new Cold War, but an emerging low-intensity conflict with Russia. How did you feel about the NATO and the West's response to to Russia's guerrilla war in Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea? And what does that response signal to you and to your countries and your neighbors?
I think, of course, the biggest difference is that Ukraine is not a part of NATO, and the Baltics are part of NATO, and that's a completely different picture. But I think the NATO reacted very fast, so we did go to Wales, and President Obama was in Tallinn for going to Wales, and sending very clear signal that security of Baltic partners is a big matter for the United States. Of course, we were able to come up with a rapid action plan, and that's what we have. So I think we reacted quite fast, and of course, right now we are ahead of us is Warsaw. So that's where we would like to see in Warsaw that yes, from this rapid action plan, we will go to something more long term, and we should adapt to new situation. We might just be able to react fast. It's good. We need to react fast, but then we need to adapt long term also, and that's. When we start to be serious about adaptation for long term, that sends very clear and very strong signal to Russia. Because the world is different. So if Russia behaving aggressively, of course there is a reaction to it. So it's not that we will be sitting and just looking at what's happening there, and we will be not talking our way out of it. So we need really to do certain steps, on the ground, which I believe we will be doing, and we are doing already.
Thank you. Ambassador Schur, obviously it's big news that a lot of us are following here in the United States is the British referendum on their continued membership in the European Union. And as someone who's spent his career advocating for greater integration among allies and countries in Europe and the West, are you concerned about the message that this this referendum sends to our enemies, particularly to Russia, about our solidarity as a bloc and as a community?
Of course I'm concerned. Of course I'm concerned. I think everybody in Europe is concerned about the possibility of the UK leaving the European Union. I don't think personally it will happen, but okay, you never know how foolish somebody can be, and I would personally consider it the height of foolishness on UK side to leave a European Union where, on the one hand, they have gotten a large number of exceptions already. They are not part of the Eurogroup, they are not part of Schengen, they do not participate in most of our social directives, they are not part of the European Court of Human Rights, so they have a lot of exceptions already. They get some extra now, so they have a special position in the European Union. Why would you leave an organization where basically you have the best of both worlds? You have the exception for those parts you do not want to participate in, and you have all the advantages of this giant internal market where you export more than 50% of your goods to. But okay, once again, in the present circumstances where I don't think anybody in the world knows what the hell is going on from time to time, you do not know what will happen. I think our main worry will be that we will become a pick and choose community. People might pick up the cue and say, you know what, if the Brits can work out this deal, I have some problems with certain issues in the European Union as well. Why don't I ask for an exception on this one, and I keep all the good parts for myself, and the bad parts I try to offload on somebody else. The European Union is built on solidarity among its members, and solidarity means that at the end of the day, I have negotiated for years in the European Union. At the end of the week, you sat together and said, on Monday I won on agriculture, on Tuesday I lost on transport, on Wednesday I won on internal market, and on Friday it was a break, but in the end it was a zero-sum game. That is the basis of the European Union, a balance between pros and cons. And if somebody takes only the pros and leaves away the cons, the balance is lost, and then the European Union will start to fracture.
Thank you, Ambassador. And Dr. Levinson, do you think it's time for the United States and our allies to go on offense in the cyber conflict, or do you think we should continue to react only defensively to these threats?
Well, that presumes that we're not acting offensively right now, but out of the public view, which of course I can't discuss. But the problem, there was an article in the Washington Post just recently on the editorial page about offense is a bad idea. There exists out in the world invisible armies, and we are a world at war in cyberspace. But unlike physical war, there are no peace talks, there are no truces, there are no negotiated settlements. We cannot communicate with the adversary. And it's very hard to do the forensics to find out exactly who punched us. And if someone attacks us and we go and attack the wrong party, geography in cyberspace is nothing like geography in physical space. If we attack the wrong party, the results could be catastrophic. One of the issues I'm working with NATO on is Article 5 of the Washington Treaty basically simply states an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. It's the mutual self-defense portion of NATO. Article 5 was last invoked on September 11, 2001. I am working with different groups of people to try and understand what would constitute an Article 5 issue in cyberspace. Now, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but Lithuania and Poland are, and there are shared resources between those nations. Is a cyber attack on Estonia by Russia, and there is no doubt as to attribution, is that an Article 5 offense? Is that an act of war? So these are very difficult issues when we shift from physical space into cyberspace. So attacking back, it's very hard to know who we're attacking back at. And unless our forensics are 100% accurate, we risk sending a cruise missile, essentially, to the wrong location. So I don't believe that that's wholly practical at this point.
Will, before you go to the, I have to ask Dr. Levinson one question, which this is fascinating what he just said. How does a nation like North Korea, technologically inferior, have the capability for such extensive cyber? Is it through proxy? Is it China? What is it that makes a rogue nation with weak capabilities so good at this?
Well, Mr. Secretary, there are a number of answers to that question. North Korea does engage in intelligence collection. They are very active in intelligence collection globally. There are a number of nations that communicate with North Korea. China certainly does. In fact, China is our only way of communicating with the North Korean regime. But what North Korea has proven is, yes, they can launch an ICBM, and yes, they can deliver a satellite into an unstable orbit. They called it Earth observing, which means a spy satellite. And it's in an unstable orbit. It will ultimately degrade, burn up in the atmosphere, but that satellite is most likely powered by a nuclear pile, an atomic pile. We've withheld solar cell technology from them. The North Koreans are amazing collectors, and they do maintain diplomatic liaisons in a number of places, but they're kept very quiet. No one wants to be seen as aiding and abetting a truly rogue state. And yet, there are those that find advantage there. Does that help, sir?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you, Elise Lavin from CNN. Thank you so much for a very interesting discussion. Dr. Levinson, I thought it was interesting that you brought up the Article 5, and I'm hoping we could play that out a little bit on the area of Syria. Governor Richardson, you mentioned a no-fly zone, but there are also some people that think that perhaps if Turkey were to get into some kind of conflict with Russia, they would be looking to drag NATO into. My understanding is that NATO has said to Turkey, do not do that because we're not going to be dragged in. But I'm just wondering, outside of a preemptive Russian attack on Turkey, is NATO, do you really think NATO, for any of the powers, do you think NATO would really be prepared to get into some kind of conflict with Russia, which really just extends the kind of battlefield outside of Europe into a new battlefield with Russia? Thank you.
Well, there's more to the issue than Russia. There's also the issue of Syria. And there was a recent episode, recent within a year, that Turkey lost a warplane over disputed airspace. Turkey, a NATO ally, publicly protested that Syrian air forces shot down their plane and went to the North Atlantic Council, and I report in to NATO's civil military planning, and the body is the Civil Emergency Planning Committee, which reports up to the North Atlantic Council, the 28 ambassadors. Turkey convened an Article 5 hearing to request mutual self-defense against Syria. Russia is not the only bad guy here. We have bad guys in the Middle East, and when you look at the physical geography around Greece, Turkey, some of the Eastern European nations, the Baltics, Russia is not the only issue. It is an issue, but there are other issues. To declare an Article 5 issue against Russia, for example, Estonia had every right to. They're everything. Once the Baltics became independent, they became instantly high-tech nations. Once the Castro boys have their last cigar, Cuba will become the highest tech nation on earth. We will light up that island end to end. Everything will be digital. So with the Baltics, they became instantly very high technology nations. An awful lot of Western money helped prop that up, but that also made them subject to extensive cyber attack. So the criteria for an Article 5 issue is what constitutes an act of war in physical space, which is hard, because the North Atlantic Council dismissed the issue with Turkey and Syria. And what constitutes an Article 5 issue in the world of cyberspace? What are the criteria? Do people have to die? If so, how many? What is the impact on critical infrastructure? It gets very, very complicated. And what is the intent behind the attack? If the intent behind the attack is to disable or damage an entire nation, well, that's an attack on national sovereignty. What is it an Article 5 issue? And this is being debated constantly. We ourselves in the US are not sure what constitutes an active war via cyberspace.
But in the context of Syria, I mean, outside of an Article 5 declaration and a kind of preemptive attack by Russia, I mean, I guess for Dr. Scherer, Ambassador Scherer, sorry, do you anticipate NATO really getting involved in Syria, which, as I was just trying to point out, would certainly be, you know, obviously they'd be getting involved for the conflict in Syria, but that would be sparking a direct conflict with Russia.
I do not see NATO immediately getting involved in Syria, also for the simple reason that we would be looking, I think, our preferred as the Netherlands, but I think a number of European countries as well, we would look for what we call a coalition of the willing. For the reason that we want, this is a conflict on the border of Europe and the Middle East. We would like the Middle Eastern countries to play a role as well. If we would make this a NATO conflict of a NATO participation, I think it will be much more difficult to draw in other countries from the Middle East region, which we think is essential for success in the Middle East. So I think that what you might see is in the end a coalition of the willing, where you would use certain NATO assets, and then the example, of course, is Libya, where that happened exactly the same, but not an exclusive NATO conflict.
Now, I'm not in the government, so I can pretty much say what I want. My view is that, one, a no-fly zone is necessary, because it's a new dimension to a problem that is not getting resolved. It's a new mix that might be helpful. Secondly, I think NATO can provide that umbrella without necessarily triggering Article 5. I've always felt that NATO should be, this is a legitimate out-of-area issue. The refugee issue has threatened Europe. That NATO should have been triggered. But that's, I think as the ambassador mentioned, probably not probable right now. What I would do is I would see how this ceasefire works. You know, there's varying reports. So far it's holding somewhat. And the most important reason that I think that a no-fly zone is needed is it would really test Russia. Is Russia's intent really just to help Assad and not do anything with ISIS? Is it just provincial arguments? Or are they ready to participate in a transition of a new government in Syria with perhaps Assad still playing some kind of role? We haven't tested Russia there. Would Russia be ready for a conflict with NATO? I don't think so. I think what also a no-fly zone would do is it would bring some humanitarian corridors that Turkey needs to look at. I mean, Turkey's should be doing more. You know, what they're doing with the Syrian Kurds, some diplomacy is needed there. So I think that no-fly zone is a mix that might spur some kind of betterment of the situation. Resolution, no. But that's what I think.
Any other questions from the audience? First back there, yes.
Hi, Kendall Clark, I work at Wiley. My question is for you, Dr. Levinson. I'm interested in knowing what sort of policy recommendations or how you think that NATO could be better able to combat these criminals or nimble terrorist organizations such as ISIS in the technology realm.
Well, NATO has a cyber rapid reaction team of which I'm a member. Several of my colleagues from the 28 are members. NATO, in terms of technology, as I said originally, we have NATO allies who are very high technology nations, and NATO allies who are not high technology nations. The ones who are not high technology nations are the obvious victims. Any criminal will assault the weakest attack surface. Why would you break in or try to break in to GCHQ in Britain when it would be easier to do something in Eastern Europe where the nations are smaller and at a less robust technology level and less able to defend themselves? But once you get in, you can get into the NATO network. We're all connected. So naturally, adversaries would attack at the weakest point. Did that answer you?
Yes and no. That's actually a really interesting point, but I've been sort of interested in how, so in terms of the United States, the government is an enormous sort of entity. To do sort of a technology or a policy change takes a really long time, whereas ISIS, for example, a small and very technologically savvy organization, can implement sort of a sea change really fast. And I was just curious in terms of how one such as NATO or just the United States or a big government agency is equipped to sort of respond, react, or even preempt such changes.
There's a phrase in the United States that things move at the speed of government. With apologies to my ambassadorial colleagues, things at NATO move at the speed of 28 governments. Which means, yes, reactions are very slow. And NATO is all about consensus. And building consensus across 28 allies who have differing attitudes about each other, it's very slow.
Looks like we have just time for one more question, so right here. Yep, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Larry Lux, New News Editor of the Washington Diplomat, and this question is for both ambassadors and Governor Richardson. All of you mentioned the need to reach 2% of GDP in defense spending among NATO's members, and at the same time you've also talked about the migration crisis with possibly more refugees from the Middle East coming to Europe than even last year. I'm wondering, how can these governments afford the 2% threshold in defense spending while at the same time absorbing all of these refugees, feeding them, housing them, and relocating them? Aren't those both important priorities that deserve attention, and might one take away from the other? Thank you.
I could say that of course there are always trade-offs as far as public expenditures are concerned, but right now I should say that we are ready to do both. So we will be increasing. We have a political agreement among all parties, position opposition, so everyone is in agreement to do it. So as I said, the pace we are doing it currently, we will make it earlier than it was agreed to. It's 2018. At the same time, of course, we are always very much in solidarity with all our European partners as far as migration crisis is concerned. So we are always ready to play our part, and we will do it. Our economy is growing, so it's a bigger pace, which allows us to do this. So I'm 100% sure we will meet the challenge.
I'm slightly less optimistic. We have taken in 65,000 refugees last year. We expect to take in probably more next year of this year. That's an enormous burden. We have turned the corner. We are no longer cutting our defense budget for the first time last year. We've increased our defense budget. We have a trajectory that we will increase every year. I think that the present government is the assignment that we will keep increasing our defense budget until we are at a level close or at 2%. I'm very much afraid that if we get more refugees, that we might not make it in the number of years that we have thought, and it might take a little bit longer. However, I can assure you that our resolve is to honor the pledges that everybody made, and we will get there. But we have a budget to take care of, and we have maybe 80,000 extra refugees on top of the 65,000 refugees to take care of, and that costs money.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone who came to the event today, and also to our distinguished panelists. I think we had a very interesting discussion, and I hope we can continue in the future. And on behalf of McBee and Wiley Ryan, thank you very much for coming.
Tell them what I said. I said you first.